on a day that would forever alter the quiet town of Oak Ridge, deep in Oregon. Sheriff Thomas Wilkins received an anonymous tip on October 17, 1997. A neighbor, who insisted on remaining unnamed, reported bizarre noises coming from a remote property owned by the Blackwood family, who had lived in that mountainous region since the 1800s. A recording of the call, kept in the Lane County Police Archives, preserved the man's words. "There is something wrong in that barn. I have never seen anyone come in or out, but at night sometimes I hear shouts. They are not animals." What the police discovered at Blackwood Farm, located some 40 kilometers from Oak Ridge's center, was beyond anything they could have imagined. Concealed by thick overgrowth and encircled by a nearly 3-meter-high barbed wire fence, stood a faded red barn that seemed ordinary from afar. Yet its single entrance was secured by numerous locks, chains, and padlocks. The stench was the first thing that assaulted the officers when they forced the door open, a foul combination of urine, excrement, and something one officer would later characterize as the scent of humanity's utter absence. Inside, dimly lit by slivers of light from roof cracks, they discovered 7 women, ranging from 12 to 42 years old, existing in circumstances the police report would later call irreconcilable with any standard of human dignity. "I swoon," Dr. Michael Stevenson, a coroner on the scene, told the Portland Herald, adding that in his 27-year medical career, he had never witnessed such a sight. The women displayed physical traits that pointed directly to severe inbreeding and prolonged malformations, extra digits, clear vision issues, and disturbingly, each possessed the exact same vacant stare. Later investigations would show the barn was not merely a prison for victims, but the site of a multi-generational experiment in family endogamy spanning at least 5 generations. Genetic analysis conducted at the University of Oregon confirmed these were likely the most inbred women ever recorded in modern U.S. history. The land was officially owned by Jeremiah Blackwood, then 68, the patriarch of a family that had gradually cut itself off from society over many decades. What had started as simple social withdrawal eventually morphed into one of the most horrifying documented accounts of abuse, isolation, and deliberate genetic manipulation. The initial inquiry revealed that 4 of the 7 women were Jeremiah's biological daughters, while the other 3 were the offspring of unions between his children and daughters over time. The inbreeding coefficient for some of them, as later determined by University of Washington geneticists, reached astonishing levels near 0.375 numbers, almost unheard of outside of profoundly isolated groups. "This was not a case of ignorance or accident," stated Dr. Eliza Montgomery, the forensic geneticist leading the case. "We discovered detailed journals that show a clear and purposeful aim to establish what they termed a pure lineage." The notes included observations on specific physical attributes and attempts to select traits like eye color and bone structure through planned pairings between close relatives. The Blackwood case not only horrified the small town, but also revived debates on rural isolation, community oversight, and the boundaries of family privacy in America's remote areas. The Blackwood family's history traces back to the Great Depression, when Elijah Blackwood, Jeremiah's grandfather, bought the 200-acre plot in 1931 for a price far below its value. Original Lane County documents indicate that Elijah, a former miner ruined by the economic crash, paid a mere $175 for the land, a sum considered exceptionally low, even for that era. According to local historical records, the property had a dark history. In 1924, the previous owner, John Wickman, had killed his entire family before taking his own life, and since then, no one had wanted the land. This event, while seemingly separate from the Blackwood story, set a pattern of isolation and superstition that would determine the family's destiny. Elijah Blackwood moved in with his wife Martha and their 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls. Preserved school records at the Oak Ridge Municipal Library show that children attended the local school for only a year before being withdrawn for homeschooling. A 1933 official dismissal document from the school includes a note from the principal at the time. Family demonstrates extreme, reclusive behavior. Children show adequate knowledge for their age, but avoid interaction with other students. The family rarely visited town, making only 2 or 3 trips a year to purchase essentials they couldn't produce themselves. A journal kept by the owner of a local store between 1935 and 1940, now held at the Oak Ridge Historical Museum, notes, "The Blackwoods came today. As usual, the children and Mrs. B stayed in the car, while the old man did the shopping. No one in that family ever smiles. Bought unusually large quantities of kerosene and ammunition. Something about them isn't right." During World War II, when recruitment agents visited the property in 1943, they were met with armed resistance. Police records from the period note that Elijah threatened the officers with a shotgun, declaring that no Blackwood would spill blood for a government that only remembers men when it needs them to die, for reasons not fully explained in the archived reports. The authorities chose not to pursue the matter. It was within this environment of paranoia and seclusion that Harold Blackwood, Elijah's middle son and Jeremiah's father, came of age. Documents uncovered during the 1997 investigation show that Harold married his own second cousin, Rebecca, who was from Idaho. The marriage was registered in Boise in 1952, but no one in Oak Ridge ever saw Rebecca. Harold just showed up one day with a wife, recalled Alina Wilson, then 93, a former store clerk. "We never really got a look at her, you know? She was always in the car, wearing a big floppy hat and a veil, even in the summer." Letters from her family in Idaho stopped arriving after a few years. Medical records found on the property indicate Rebecca gave birth to 6 children between 1953 and 1962, all at home without any medical help. Of these, only 3 survived past infancy. Jeremiah, born in 1956, Mary in 1958, and Joseph in 1961. The other 3 infants died from congenital issues. According to notes Harold kept in a notebook that served as an improvised family medical log. A particularly chilling entry from 1962 hints at the moment the ideology of genetic isolation began to solidify. "Rebecca is too weak for more children, but we don't need outsiders. We have our own pure blood, strong like steel when kept without mixture. The weak die so the strong prosper. This is the law of nature that the city men have forgotten." When Harold died in a tractor accident in 1978, Jeremiah, then 22, assumed control of the property and the family. By that time, tax records show the family had enlarged the main house and constructed 2 additional buildings on the land, one being the barn that would 2 decades later become the epicenter of the discovered horror. The family's isolation deepened under Jeremiah's rule, while his father had maintained minimal contact with the town for crucial supplies. Jeremiah reduced these interactions to almost nothing. Records from a farm supply store indicate the last Blackwood purchase was in 1983, when Jeremiah bought vast quantities of seeds, tools, and building materials enough to support a long period of total self-sufficiency. Most disturbingly, as journals seized in 1997 revealed, was the shift from mere social isolation to a conscious project of genetic purification. Jeremiah, who had apparently cultivated a self-taught interest in genetics from books found on the property, began methodically documenting the family's physical traits and planning unions between relatives. "The outside world corrupts the blood," he wrote in a 1985 entry. "Each generation that remains pure strengthens what we are. The weak will die, the strong will prosper. In 5 generations, we will have created something the world has never seen. The Red Barn, built in 1980, according to property records, was designed from the start not as a farm building but as a detention facility. Hand-drawn plans by Jeremiah detailed a 2-story structure with internal walls, a basic water system, and, most alarmingly, a complex locking mechanism that could only be operated from the outside. The 7 women rescued in 1997 lived in what police described as medieval conditions. The barn's ground floor held a common area with a long wooden table, some rough-hewn benches, and a wood stove that offered meager heat during Oregon's harsh winters. The upstairs was partitioned into small cubicles that served as individual sleeping quarters, each with a straw mattress and a bucket for waste. There was no electricity. There was no proper plumbing, stated the Social Services report. Water was provided by a gutter system that collected rainwater in barrels during dry spells. Jeremiah, or his brother Joseph, would bring water from a nearby well. The barn's windows had been nailed shut and boarded over, allowing light to enter only through thin cracks and a few translucent roof panels. Psychologists who later evaluated the victims said this was a calculated method of causing temporal disorientation. The women had only a vague sense of time, based on the natural light filtering through these limited openings. The case grew even more troubling when Sarah, the eldest of the women at 42, began speaking to investigators. Sarah, identified as Jeremiah's biological daughter with his sister Mary, had been the first to be imprisoned in the barn at age 15. Daddy said we were special, that our blood was purer than any family in America, Sarah said in a recorded statement, now part of an FBI extreme case study archive. He had horse breeding books, how breeders maintain pure strains. He said, we were doing the same thing, only better. If you also feel the weight of this story, comment now. Purity does not justify the cruelty. According to the diaries and Sarah's testimony, the family system operated with methodical precision. Women were moved to the barn upon reaching puberty. There, they were regularly visited by Jeremiah or Joseph on a rotation schedule, documented in notebooks found in the main house. These visits led to frequent pregnancies, though many ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. Weak babies did not survive, and this was seen as natural, even desirable, explained Dr. Robert Peterson, the court-appointed forensic psychiatrist. Male children who survived were taken to the main house to be raised, while the girls stayed in the barn with their mothers, perpetuating the cycle. The women's daily routine, as reconstructed by investigators, mainly involved chores, sewing, preparing simple meals, cleaning their confined space, and tending a small adjacent garden where they could spend short, supervised periods outdoors. Ironically, this garden was the sole source of beauty in their lives. Various flowers grew among the vegetables, creating a surreal contrast with the darkness of their existence. Improvised. Medical records maintained by Jeremiah revealed a disturbing clinical detachment. Each woman had a file noting her physical characteristics, pregnancy history, and, most disturbingly, her reproductive value rated on a scale of 1 to 10. The food provided to the women was surprisingly nutritious, though monotonous, consisting mainly of homegrown vegetables, eggs, milk, and sometimes meat. This was not a typical case of nutritional deprivation, stated nutritionist Elizabeth Dawson in her report. On the contrary, there was an almost obsessive focus on certain nutrients. They discovered homemade herbal supplements apparently created to strengthen the blood. As described in Jeremiah's notes, communication with the outside world was non-existent. The women had no radios, newspapers, or any other information sources. Their knowledge was limited to what they learned from each other and the few books allowed in the barn, mostly practical manuals on farming, home remedies, and disturbingly, an altered Bible from which Jeremiah had removed sections and added his own texts. One of the most unsettling finds was the notebooks of Emma, the second oldest woman, then 37, hidden under her mattress. They contained detailed drawings of what she imagined the outside world to be like, based only on stories from the older women and the few images in their books. Her sketches of modern cities looked like 19th century illustrations. revealing the profound informational void they lived in. They created their own communication system, explained Dr. Linda Morris, a linguist who analyzed the women's interactions after the rescue. It wasn't a new language, but they used common words with specific meanings only they understood. For instance, they called the sun the Watcher and had dozens of distinct terms for the sounds the barn made during storms. When questioned about resistance or escape attempts, the women exhibited a conditioned fear response. "Where would we go?" asked Lily, then 23, during a therapy session. "Daddy said the outside world was full of radiation, that people were sick and deformed. He said we were the only healthy ones, and that one day when it was safe, we would leave and repopulate the earth." This apocalyptic mythology, crafted by Jeremiah to rationalize the isolation, had been developed over decades and incorporated distorted elements of real news events like the Chernobyl disaster and the AIDS epidemic, which he presented as proof of civilization's impending collapse. When the 7 women were examined at the University of Oregon Medical Center, doctors documented the physical consequences of generations of inbreeding. A medical report later published anonymously in the American Journal of Medical Genetics detailed a cluster of conditions rarely seen in such concentration. The observed anomalies suggest severe and sustained consanguinity over multiple generations, wrote Dr. James Richardson, the study's lead geneticist. "We are seeing the expression of several rare, recessive genes that would typically remain dormant in more genetically diverse populations. Among the most visible conditions were polydactyly extra fingers or toes, present in 5 of the 7 women, and severe dental malformations, including oligodontia, congenital absence of teeth, and microdontia, abnormally small teeth. 4 women had heterochromia, each eye a different color, a trait Jeremiah apparently prized and tried to select for, according to his journals. More concerning were the internal conditions. Imaging revealed cardiac malformations in all the women, ranging from minor septal defects to serious conditions like tetralogy of Fallot in 2 of them. The most severe case was that of Rose, 19, the medical report stated. She presented a combination of conditions we almost never see together in one patient. Craniosynostosis, premature skull-bone fusion, causing severe facial deformity, achondroplasia, a form of dwarfism, and a severe immune deficiency that made her extremely vulnerable to infections. It is remarkable she survived to this age without medical intervention. One of the youngest, April, then 14, had phenylketonuria, a rare metabolic disorder that went untreated, causing irreversible neurological damage. The cognitive and psychological impact was equally profound. Neuropsychological tests showed 5 of the 7 women had some degree of intellectual disability, though it was difficult to determine how much was genetic and how much was due to extreme educational and sensory deprivation. "Sarah's case is particularly interesting," said neuropsychologist Dr. Patricia Winters. "Despite the extreme isolation, she demonstrates above-average cognitive ability. She had taught herself to read, using the few available books, and then taught the others. She even devised a complex timekeeping system based on the light patterns from the roof cracks." DNA tests using the latest technology at the time confirmed what the physical symptoms suggested. The inbreeding coefficient for some of the younger women reached levels seldom seen in modern medical literature. In simple terms, these women's DNA contains long identical segments on both chromosomes. Dr. Richardson explained in a 1999 Scientific American interview. This only happens when the same genes are inherited from both parents, who in turn share very close common ancestors. In this case, up to 37% of the genome of some of the younger women consisted of these identical segments, numbers we'd only expect in extreme cases of population isolation. Perhaps the most disturbing discovery was the documentation found in the main house, in a locked office. investigators found dozens of notebooks where Jeremiah had meticulously recorded his observations over decades. These journals revealed the patriarch was aware of the genetic risks, but saw them as a necessary purification process. The first generations will suffer, so that future ones can transcend, he wrote in a 1992 entry. The ancient Egyptians understood this. The pharaohs married their sisters for divine reasons, not worldly ones. The weak are naturally eliminated. The strong survive and grow stronger. In another 10 generations, we will have created a superior lineage. This distortion of basic science to justify extreme abuse reflected a toxic blend of isolation, paranoia, and pathological narcissism. Jeremiah had constructed an elaborate belief system mixing poorly understood genetics, decontextualized religious references, and conspiracy theories about racial purity and modern society's genetic decay. Among the books found on the property were early 20th century eugenics texts, treatises on animal husbandry, and surprisingly, several recent academic books on population genetics, suggesting Jeremiah occasionally obtained updated materials, possibly through mail order. He was not an uneducated man, said Dr. Peterson in his psychological assessment. He demonstrated considerable intelligence, but it was severely warped by isolation, possible untreated mental illness, and selective exposure to information that reinforced his pre-existing beliefs. It is a classic case of how knowledge without proper social context or ethical guidance can be dangerously misapplied. The morning of October 21, 1997, marked the start of a new life for the 7 women of the Blackwood barn. After 4 days of initial medical assessments, they were moved to a specialized facility in Portland, where a multidisciplinary team of doctors, psychologists, social workers, and special educators began what would become one of the most complex rehabilitation processes ever documented in the United States. The legal fate of Jeremiah and Joseph Blackwood unfolded alongside this. Both were arrested the day the barn was discovered, and, after extensive psychiatric evaluation, were deemed fit to stand trial. In September 1998, after a 3-week trial that captured national attention, Jeremiah was sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms without parole for multiple counts of kidnapping, rape, incest, and child abuse. Joseph, whose lawyers argued he acted under the psychological coercion of his older brother, received a 45-year sentence. This is not merely a case of extreme abuse, said Judge Eleanor Hayes during sentencing. It is a case of the deliberate and systematic perversion of fundamental human principles, extending for decades and affecting multiple generations. The court rarely encounters circumstances where a defendant's reintegration into society is deemed fundamentally impossible, but this is one such case. Jeremiah remained emotionless throughout the proceedings, refusing to acknowledge the court's authority. His only statement during sentencing revealed the depth of his warped conviction. "You don't understand what you have destroyed. It was not a prison. It was a sanctuary. It was not cruelty. It was directed evolution. In 100 years, when your lineages are weak and sick, the world will regret what was lost here." Joseph, in contrast, gradually showed signs of understanding the gravity of his actions. In a letter to the court before sentencing, he wrote, "I grew up believing the world was, as Jeremiah said. I never knew another reality. That does not justify what I did, but perhaps it explains how a human being can become an accomplice to something so horrible, without fully recognizing its horror." For the 7 women, the reintegration process would be long and complex. The special program developed for them by the University of Oregon, later known as the Blackwood Protocol, became a model for rehabilitating victims of prolonged extreme isolation. "We couldn't just thrust them into the modern world," explained program coordinator Dr. Catherine Morris. "Everything from the constant noise of a city to basic concepts like electricity, television, or the internet was completely alien to them. We had to create a transitional environment where they could be gradually introduced to aspects of modern life, always with intensive psychological support. The case took a new turn in 2001 when Sarah Blackwood, the oldest of the rescued women, published her memoir with Dr. Morris's help. The book, Born in Darkness, Memories of the Blackwood Barn, became an instant bestseller and was later adapted into an award-winning HBO documentary. The proceeds were placed in a trust fund to support the ongoing treatment and education of all the survivors. "We are not just victims," Sarah wrote in her book's epilogue. "We are survivors. And now, finally, we are people entitled to our own futures." The story of the barn is over, but our individual stories are just beginning. The impact of the Blackwood case extended far beyond those directly involved. In 2003, the U.S. Congress passed the SARA Law, establishing new protocols for monitoring homeschooled children in isolated rural areas. The law also created special funds to train professionals in rural communities to identify signs of extreme family abuse. Within the scientific community, the anonymous medical data from the Blackwood women, collected with their informed consent, significantly advanced the understanding of severe inbreeding's effects on humans. A longitudinal study still ongoing at the University of Washington continues to monitor the genetic, medical, and psychological aspects of the case, generating dozens of scientific papers that have helped improve treatments for various rare genetic conditions. In 2015, 18 years after the rescue, the Blackwood property was finally demolished after being acquired by the state of Oregon. A small memorial was erected where the barn once stood, a simple bronze plaque bearing the words, "To honor the resilience of the human spirit in the face of extreme cruelty, to remember that isolation should never replace community vigilance." Of the 7 rescued women, 5 eventually established independent lives, though with varying degrees of need for continued support. Rose and April, the most severely affected genetically, remained in specialized care. Sarah, the eldest, became a respected activist for abuse victims' rights and a symbol of resilience. In a speech at the 2010 National Conference on Child Abuse, she offered a powerful perspective. "People often ask me how I survived those years in the barn. The truth is, I survived because I never knew there was an alternative. Now I know there was a whole world beyond those walls. My mission is to make sure no child ever grows up without knowing they are entitled to that world." The legacy of the Blackwood case remains a dark reminder of the extremes of human isolation and the abuse that can fester when communities lose touch with their most isolated members. It also stands as a testament to the extraordinary human capacity for recovery and adaptation, even after enduring atrocities that challenge the limits of understanding. If you have watched this far, it is because this story resonated with you. Leave a comment saying "I watched here" so I can get to know you and see who truly follows the channel. Don't forget to subscribe to learn about more real cases like this. Give a like to support our investigative work, and share this impactful story with others who value documentaries that reveal the most obscure realities of the human condition.